All right. Thank you for joining us here today. My name is Clayton Sinyai. I'm the Executive Director of the Catholic Labor Network. And thank you for joining us for our a webinar on unions, Catholic social teaching, and bargaining for the common good. Now, the concept of for those of us who are Catholic, the concept of bargaining the concept of the common good should be a familiar one. It's a core element of Catholic social teaching. I looked up Pope John the 23rd's letter Mater et Magistra, which laid out what a just society was and how it operated. And I found that he used the term common good 27 different times in this short letter about the social order. Every time pointing out how it is not a just society when one group or another, or one individual or another, pursues their own advantage. Only when social institutions serve the common good do you have a true just social order, and that's what the church calls us to. Well, there's a parallel movement in the labor movement these days called bargaining for the common good, a movement in which unions and community organizations come together and identify shared goals to pursue side by side. And we're going to talk about that today. A little housekeeping before we get started. If you've just joined us, I invite you to turn on your mute for the moment so there's no background noise during the speakers. And we are recording this. We'll be sharing it on our YouTube channel after the fact. With that, I will hand off to our first speaker today, Professor Joe Mccarten, Executive Director of the Manavits Initiative for Labor and the Working Poor, who's going to give us background on bargaining for the common good and what it's all about. Joe, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Clayton. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm going to share my screen so that I can share a PowerPoint with you. And this will help me get through an overview in a kind of organized way. We'll make this available for you to peruse later if you'd like. So what is bargaining for the common good? What are its origins? Why now is it emerging? What are its key elements, and how does it look moving forward? Those are the things we want to hear about today, and I'll talk with you about. First of all, how would we define bargaining for the common good? I would define it this way: as unions and community members partnering around a long-term vision for the structural changes they want to see in their institutions and communities, using union bargaining, collective bargaining, as a critical tool in a broader campaign to win that change. In a way, bargaining for the common good represents the continuation of a long tradition in American unions going back to the 19th century. Groups like the Knights of Labor, who developed a kind of community unionism around a thing called mixed assemblies. All the way up to the 1990s, the AFL-CIO had a labor and community alliance building program called Union Cities. So for a long time, unions have thought about aligning with community groups. Bargaining for the common good is also a way of reviving another element of our labor history, and that is part of labor history in which unions in the past have fought for more than just their members, but for social change. This goes back to, say, the year 1900, when Chicago teacher unionists formed a union and began to campaign for tax reform in the city, exposing tax dodgers who were depriving the city schools of their funding. Or auto workers after World War II who went on strike, demanding that General Motors raise their wages, but also at the same time keep the price of cars down, as they fought for in 1945 and 46, and open the books of the company to prove that it could in fact raise wages without raising prices. Or to 1965, when welfare workers in New York City went on strike, not only to improve their own pay, but also to fight for reforms in a broken welfare system. So for a long period of time, unions in our past have fought for larger social goals than simply improving, although that's vital, the needs and the lives of their members. They fought for the common good very often, but over time, what happened to our collective bargaining system is that these broader approaches to collective bargaining eventually got sort of whittled down to a more narrow focus on wages, benefits, and working conditions. So part of what bargaining for the common good is about is rediscovering an older tradition, updating it for the needs of the present. This has a great connection, I think, to the Catholic tradition, as Clayton pointed out. The US labor movement has deep interconnections with the American Catholic Church. And here's a gallery of labor leaders of our past who were Catholic and for whom Catholicism was an important influence, from Mother Jones to Richard Trumka in recent times. So Catholics have played a role in our movement over time, and Catholic ideas are very much in resonance with a lot of what labor is fighting for. As Clayton pointed out, Catholic social teaching has itself been something that has pushed forward the idea of the common good. This is an important idea going back to Pope Leo's Rerum Novarum, and it's carried on in recent times by theologians like my colleague at Georgetown, David Hollenbach, who talks about the common good. But for the purposes of our discussion today, what we're talking about is the rediscovery of these old traditions and their revivification, their enlivenment in the struggles of recent times by workers in alliance with community members. A key element or moment in this emergence happened in 2012 when the Chicago Teachers Union went on strike for the schools Chicago children deserve, wanting improvements in the pay of Chicago teachers, but demanding widespread reforms in the whole way that education was run in Chicago. That strike really triggered a growth of a new idea within the labor movement of how we might bargain for the common good in a lot of new and different ways. And out of that strike emerged a lot of experiments that have been going on, including one we'll hear about that just happened in Connecticut, for how to translate common good ideas into labor fights today. So an innovative approach to bargaining in the public sector is one thing that bargaining for the common good has been about. And it's been about changing the participants in bargaining by broadening its participants to include the community in the process, to enlist community organizations, to build an ongoing alignment between the community and labor. So it's broadening, you might say, the bargaining table. It's also broadening the processes of bargaining by bringing the community and its allies, its labor allies, into joint action, using their joint action to raise joint demands, mobilizing militantly to advance those demands. It's also about broadening the purposes and the goals of bargaining, broadening the scope of bargaining to expose the power relations and the economic and political forces that are undermining workers, communities, and the common good, fostering new solidarities, creating an enduring alignment of progressive forces. These are the things that bargaining for the common good has been fighting for in a series of struggles in recent years, from the Chicago teachers to LA teachers to the Connecticut workers and many others that we're about to hear about today, who can do bargaining for the common good. Really anyone, any union, any community group, I think, can come together in the ways that we're about to hear our Connecticut friends describe. And by coming together, we focus on 7 key things that are usually part of these campaigns: expanding the scope of bargaining beyond wages and benefits, going on the offense, identifying and exposing and challenging the structural problems behind our oppressions, engaging community allies as partners, centering racial justice, and the Connecticut group really did this so well, strengthening internal organizing, membership and member engagement, leveraging capital in our campaigns, and functioning around the idea that when the union and community groups come together to fight for common goals, that it doesn't end with a new contract. That's just the beginning of a deeper and longer lasting alignment. So these are elements that are key. We won't focus on them any more than that now because we want to hear from our Connecticut friends. But let me just address this before we turn it over to them. Why do we need this kind of approach now? I think we need it because our system is very badly broken. Inequality is surging. We've seen that our democracy is under threat. Our planet is threatened by climate change. We're desperately in need of tools to resist these trends and to forge new and deeper solidarities in this fragmented nation. Uniting around a fight for the common good has never been more necessary. And that's just a quick overview of what bargaining for the common good is and how it's emerged over time. But I think you'll get a much better sense of it when we hear about the great work that our Connecticut friends have done and bringing this method of fighting to a new and I think really successful and higher level. And so I'll turn it over to them. But before I do, I'll drop these links in the chat where you can learn about bargaining for the common good to a greater extent. I will put those in the chat. I'll just conclude by saying that this is bargaining for the common good is an approach. It's a methodology. It's also a network of practitioners in which the folks you're about to hear from are playing a leading role, and you can link up to this network and be involved in it. And we would welcome you to do that. So I'll pause there and turn it back to you, Clayton.
Thank you so much, Joe, for introducing us to Bargaining for the Common Good. And as Joe mentioned, we're now going to hear from some practitioners of Bargaining for the Common Good, a union and a community organization in Connecticut that have worked together using these techniques. We're going to hear first from Rob Beryl, of the leader of the Service Employees International Union 1199 New England, a union that represents healthcare workers in Connecticut, who will talk right now. Let me hand over the baton to Rob.
Well, thank you for that introduction, and I'm obviously privileged to be with all of you, and also privileged to be president of 1199, which one of the people on the call, Debbie King, helped to build. So Debbie, we've never actually met face to face. I know your son-in-law quite well, of course, but great to see you. So our local, just a little bit of background, is about 25,000 members in the state of Connecticut, 6,000 public sector workers who are people that are really part of the social safety net in the state, taking care of many of the most vulnerable populations, children who've come through absolutely horrific experiences in Department of Children and Families, folks with addictions and substance abuse, and other sort of social safety net functions. And then the remainder of our membership are long-term care workers who work in nursing homes, home care, and group homes. So I would say that the important thing to know is that our long-term care membership are entirely funded by Medicaid, by definition a poor people's program, overwhelmingly female, and overwhelmingly Black and brown. Our state membership, our public sector workers are relatively better off, but they've also been seeing, really in the wake of the Great Recession, really significant stresses on that workforce, which again cares for people that are very often, sadly, folks that if it were not for state care would be, sleeping on park benches and under overpasses. Okay. And so the state workforce, our state membership is actually about 20% smaller than it was prior to the Great Recession. And we saw tremendous stagnation in terms of wages and benefits for the rest of our membership, who, while not public workers, because of Medicaid funding, are publicly funded. So it's been a very difficult, decade and a half. I'm talking prior to the pandemic, for our members who are, whether they're nurses aides or registered nurses or mental health clinicians, are people who are driven by their values, driven by a mission of caregiving. Okay, that is really something that they identify with as part of their calling and part of their vocation, and felt incredibly frustrated in terms of their lack of ability to do that. In addition to our private sector membership in long-term care, just living the lives of really poor Black, brown, and working class white workers, where they work 2 and 3 and sometimes more jobs, right? 100-hour weeks are not at all uncommon, not at all. And then you take that and then you drop the atomic bomb of the pandemic on top of it. And what we saw was really quite horrific. I mean, there were, in the epicenter of the pandemic in Connecticut was in nursing homes. Their facilities where 50% of the patient population expired. Thousands of our members had COVID-19. Dozens of our members died. Dozens of their family members died. I mean, it was horrific. Okay. And happening in an environment where there was really, like, literally no PPE whatsoever, nothing that existed in terms of protective gear. We had photos that we were putting out to the public of workers in trash bags, April, May, June, into July. Folks were wearing trash bags because they did not have protective gowns. And then when we put that out to the public, the governor's press person says there's no problem with PPE in nursing homes. If people are wearing those trash bags, it's by choice. Not coincidentally, every worker, not by design, just because of who we took photos of that was in the buildings at the time, were Black. So this was all, of course, also happening at the time that we had, the convergence of the pandemic, and then, the police murders that were taking place in 2020, plus Trump on top of it. And so it was impossible to talk about what our membership was going through. This is the background to us sort of solidifying our thinking around bargaining for the common good. Impossible for us to talk about what our membership was going through without talking about race. That is true absolutely in terms of the long-term care workforce and patient population, but also in terms of our state membership. Connecticut's about 13-14% Black. Our state membership is about 50% Black, about maybe 15 or 20% Latino. Okay, and the people that they care for, we're seeing waiting lists of 200 and 300 people for substance abuse treatment in the city of Hartford, right, the capital of the state. And we all know that in a place like Connecticut, if Johnny in Greenwich has an addiction, he gets sent to a very nice facility, a residential facility, and get taken care of really, really well. But if Jamal or Juan or working class white folks in Hartford or some of the poor cities in the state have an addiction issue, they get told to wait in line. And so with other folks that we were in connection with in the community, some really amazing progressive clergy leadership, a number of community organizations, Callie and Jamim, the leadership at Bridgeport Generation Now, and several other organizations, and then some like-minded folks in the labor movement. We began to conceptualize, how do we mount a fight back, which is not based on what we think we can win, but based on what people deserve. And so in terms of our long-term care membership, that was a couple of different things. Livable wages was a must. Okay, we had our long-term care workers, the folks without nursing degrees, are generally making $15 an hour or less. Okay, nobody can live on that. There's been a fight for 15. People can't live on 15. So we said, a minimum starting rate of 20, plus health insurance and retirement for all, and then certain racial justice demands. And then in the public sector, a couple of different places, and this is where we started to really deepen our partnership with Bridgeport Generation Now through Callie and Jamim's leadership there. Connecticut has taken some significant steps towards becoming a second chance society with a shrinking prison and jail population. That's a wonderful thing. But folks who are discharged are often sort of dropped off on the street with absolutely no supports, no place to go in many cases. And many folks who are dealing with either substance abuse or addiction issues. And so there's all types of catastrophes that can obviously take place, unfolding from that. We talked about a major investment in terms of residential care, plus addiction and substance abuse and mental health treatment options for those folks coming out of jails and prisons. We talked about making sure that mobile crisis was funded 24/7, 365 across the state. Mobile crisis are, mental health clinical intervention teams that if somebody's having, say, a suicidal episode, they can go directly to that person's house and they save lives. Well, did a little bit of research and came to find out that Bridgeport, largest city in our small state, majority Black and brown city, does not have mobile crisis 24/7, 365, while the clinicians there were reporting a 500% increase in volume of calls. Okay, and people who get on that call line, it's true, it's life and death situations in many cases. Okay, so mobile crisis 24/7, 365, and then an expansion of young adult services in terms of treatment. And we embarked with allies on a series of actions, demonstrations, civil disobediences to escalate a fight around what a just budget would look like. And that was particularly urgent after the governor put out a budget that was just, his proposed budget that came out in February of last year was awful, okay? It had $0, literally zero, for any of our long-term care workers, and then was talking about some degree of closure and privatization in the public sector. And so, we really went about raising holy hell, had, several dozen people arrested and just continuous weekly actions all across the state. In some cases, highlighting the profiteering that was taking place amongst the Wall Street crowd, where we saw, the 14 billionaires in Connecticut increase their wealth by about 20% in one calendar year. Sometimes it was talking about the crisis that our members and other union members and also community organization members were going through. And then for our members in long-term care, mobilizing strike votes. And so, that sort of escalated through the end of June. And based particularly on the strike votes in the private sector, we were able to deliver about $330 million that basically won all of the demands in terms of a $20 an hour minimum, plus retirement security and quality health care for folks. In the public sector, in terms of that bargaining for the common good work to expand social safety net programs, again, a significant number of wins. About $15 million was directed towards inmate care in existing prisons, and there were many fatalities due to COVID, which, of course, was just one of the many things that folks needed in terms of better medical care. And about $5 million was dedicated towards reentry programs for folks coming back. And then about $5 million was dedicated towards expansion of the mobile crisis work. Another $5 million dedicated towards expanding capacity for young adults 18 to 25 with mental health issues. So, we feel very proud of that work. Obviously, that was hard work. It was, I think work that people were incredibly committed to. We deepened our relationship with allies and other organizations, folks like Callie, but we really now, I think, have an eye on what it would be like to be part of the beloved community, right? Of brothers and sisters across sectors, across racial and ethnic differences, who all are fighting in a common effort to expand the horizons of justice, racial justice, economic justice, gender justice, et cetera, in our state. have come through some struggles internally. I mean, somebody said to me, I can't think of another place where another coalition where you have Black Lives Matter activists and unions that represent cops in the same coalition. And that doesn't mean it's always easy. Sometimes we recently had some very intense disagreements, but we're able to come out in a way where we actually strengthened relationships without compromising our principles. So I think that this is a frame for how to do our work in social justice that is quite powerful. And I'm actually just really excited now to listen to Callie, because she always has wisdom to drop. So listen up.
Thank you so much. Appreciate your presentation, Rob. Now I'm going to, I do want to point out for those of you who are following the numbers in that presentation, that a $20 an hour wage amounts to a $40,000 a year salary for a full-time worker. Hardly a huge sum in the state of Connecticut if you're trying to live, but what they accomplished was something important in bringing a lot of workers toward receiving a living wage for a family. Now we're going to turn over the program to Callie Heilman of Bridgeport Generation Now, a community organization that allied with the union, to talk about how that relationship developed and what it accomplished. Callie, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here and just honored to be representing Bridgeport in this conversation. And my co-director, Jameem Davis, is here in spirit with us. But let me just start by telling you all a little bit about our organization. So Bridgeport Generation Now was started in 2016. We are a community-based organization, grassroots, member-based. So we have over 300 members, and we work to strengthen civic engagement in ourselves and our communities here in the city of Bridgeport, to dismantle systemic racism and corruption here in our city, so that we can build a just, equitable, and livable place. We have a very clear understanding that democracy in Bridgeport is broken and that it's our job to fix it. So we started in 2016, really focused on issues of good government, democratic empowerment, justice, equity, and livability. And out of our work around good government, we started analyzing our local city budget every year. And that analysis, had us identify trends. And some of the trends that we kept looking at as a group was that year after year after year, our education budget in the city of Bridgeport was shrinking. And year after year after year, the police department budget was growing. And the police department budget was growing faster than our overall budget, which meant that every year that it got larger, it took money away from the things that our members and the residents of Bridgeport really cared about. So when you go out and you talk, canvassing and door knocking, what do you care about? What are you passionate about? Education is always at the top of the list. Things like infrastructure, streets, roads, parks, libraries, right? All the things that make a community wonderful. We're being divested in our city. And so every year we go before the city council and we say, more money for education, less money for the police department. And so we had this very clear concept of what a moral budget means, what a just budget means. And then also simultaneously, in 2019, we formed a public safety and police accountability group within the organization that was really focused on looking at the issue of public safety through a public health lens. So understanding that law enforcement and policing in this country is deep, has a deep history of racism and oppression. How do we reimagine public safety that in a way that takes care of the needs of residents outside of structures of law enforcement? And so, key recommendations that our group started to research were state and local funding to addressing the root causes of violence, like mental health, education, the high cost of housing, homelessness, all of the things that people in Bridgeport, residents in Bridgeport understand and see on a day-to-day basis. Then, we're doing our work. We have, our organizing muscle going, and COVID hits. And then George Floyd's murder sends a shockwave through our nation. So we really, in the summer of 2020, just got very clear that, we just delivered very clear demands to our city council, which was that we really, the time is now, to reallocate money away from our police department into social services, education, housing, and other community needs. And we were very, very loud, very proud, out in the streets with lots of other grassroots organizations here in Bridgeport sharing that same message. And then in January of this year, Norma Martinez-Hosang, who's an organizer with Bargaining for the Common Good and also part of a coalition that we're all part of now called Recovery for All, approached us at Gen Now. We knew her from organizing work, so we had a personal relationship, and she came to us and she said, look, I'm doing this Bargaining for the Common Good model, and would Bridgeport Generation Now be interested in becoming part of the community aspect of community and labor working together? And it just so happened that, we were in the middle of this fight to get more funding, a moral and just budget for mental health, addiction, substance abuse treatment. And we really focused in on the issue of mobile crisis because our public safety and police accountability group had identified the need for a non-law enforcement response to mental health crises in our community. So we almost immediately, I think because of how, how important personal relationships are, we trusted Norma, and Jamima and I almost immediately dove right in. And so by partnering with Bargaining for the Common Good, with the Recovery for All Coalition, and then by doing some really deep research into the Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services workers at 1199, we learned, which Rob said, that the Bridgeport state-run mobile crisis teams were the most understaffed in the entire state. And they only had 2 clinicians working 1 shift, and they were meant to service the entire region from Bridgeport to Stamford. So we also learned that during COVID, calls to that team had increased, I think Rob said, by 500%. So, when we got that information, and it built so strongly upon the work that we already had been doing at the ground level in Bridgeport, the next step towards action was just very easy. It just getting an action planned in Bridgeport for civil disobedience came naturally, and that's exactly what we did together. And then spent a lot of time testifying, public speaking, getting op-eds out, and pushing really hard during the legislative session. And got those wins that Rob outlined during the state budget. And what is amazing for us in Bridgeport is that by partnering with 1199, using the common good framework and our work with Recovery for All, we were also able to get a local win. And in 2021, because of our organizing, the city council voted for a budget that moved $2.5 million out of the Bridgeport Police Department to fund both education and a new social services unit for the city that would form a mobile crisis team, response team. So we couldn't have done that work or had that local win without the support and mentorship and research and policy that came with partnering with 1199 and using the common good framework. So we're just so proud of the work that we've done together thus far, and just know deep in our hearts that this is just the beginning. So thank you.
Thank you. We now have, I really appreciate that presentation. Was excited to hear about the win in the use of mobile crisis mental health professionals to respond to people in mental health crises rather than the police. I've in fact heard a lot of police departments complain that they're not equipped to handle folks in a mental health crisis. We now have time. I'm going to bring back all our speakers, and we have time for questions. I'd ask, because we have a large group here, that you drop your questions in the chat, and I will read them off to our presenters. While we're waiting for our first questions, Joe, do you have any reflections on what you've just heard from our Connecticut speakers?
Thanks, Clayton. I think that what the folks in Connecticut have done is a perfect example of how powerful this strategy and approach can be. I think that we can learn a lot from them. One thing that I have a question about, and maybe I could direct this to Rob and Callie now, is now that you've come through this, one of the key features of bargaining for the common good is thinking about sustaining your alignment beyond a campaign. So how do you see your partnership now, and where do you see it heading in the months and years ahead?
I can jump in here and then maybe Rob can fill in. For us, the partnership is really about taking policy making that Rob and, they're a much larger organization, right? And that they operate at the state level, and they have a lot more power and relationships and connections. And for us, the nature of the relationship in its longest vision is about learning from the policy making and bringing it down to the localist of levels, right? City council is as local as government gets. And how do we seed at this local level the progressive movement and voice that's happening at the state?
Rob, are you with us? Rob had to hop in the car. He was going to try to call in. He may not be connected yet. So we may have to move on from that question. We do have a question from our audience, however. How easy was it to get copies of the city budget?
Not easy. if you, Bridgeport is very, one of the natures of the systemic corruption here is that there's not a lot of transparency at the local level around our government. So not easy. And it takes having someone in your camp, in your tight, close circle, who can read very elaborate financial documents and analyze them. That person happens to be my partner, my husband, in our group. But without someone with that skill set, we would not have been able to develop the framework that showed the public and city council the trends year over year.
And how has gentrification, is there gentrification happening in Bridgeport, and how has that impacted your relationship and work with the local?
Yes, there is definitely pressure, gentrification pressure. Here in Bridgeport, housing is expensive in Connecticut, period. And as the cities along the southern coast of our state, which is closest to New York City, as they have gentrified, it's put upward pressure on Bridgeport housing prices and rents. So there's definitely gentrification. In fact, we're in a very mini campaign fight right now around a luxury developer who wants to build luxury apartments on our waterfront, but has an agreement that the affordable housing component of those apartments does not need to be built on site, that they can be built elsewhere in the city. So it's, Jamim and I often say, it's never a dull moment, never a slow day here.
All right. There's a question here that might be good for either of you. Is the best strategy with bargaining for the common good to create a coalition of existing groups, or is it advisable to create a new independent organization which can own the strategy?
I'm not sure if Rob is.
He's trying to unmute himself. He's on his phone, and
Okay.
if anyone remembers how you do that when you're on your phone, go ahead and speak up.
Hey, can you guys hear me now? I'm sorry about that.
Yes.
Oh, hey. All right.
Sorry about that. So look, I just think that question is very much one that you have to decide in each given context. For us, I would say we're not a true grassroots organization. We're more of a grass tops organization where, leadership in various organizations, unions, churches, and community groups come together to coordinate sort of larger picture joint strategy that our members, we know have an interest in. Not all of them are necessarily at the place where politically they may understand why it's important for people in a community organization in Bridgeport who may be unemployed at the moment to support state workers, but with some conversations we can get them there, or why state workers in the Department of Corrections should be supportive of Black Lives Matter campaigns, right? That is work that is done, but primarily we come together as leaders to make those decisions about where we want to throw down. But I think that those are really decisions that you make based on what's going on locally.
Joe, Kelly, you want to add anything to that?
I think one thing I would add to reinforce what Rob said is that bargaining for the common good is an approach, but it's not a strict prescription of how you do this campaigning in every setting. I think its adaptability is one of its strengths. It's got core values and ideas in its approach, but as Rob said, you kind of tailor those to what a given setting is and who the key players are as to how you go about it.
Okay, great. We have a question from Father Ike Udo. He says, in your journey through collective bargaining, what were the most challenging obstacles to moving forward? And what surprised you the most as you engaged in the process?
Thank you for that question. You know, I would say that the biggest challenge is, you know, that U.S. labor law is just set up in ways which really hobble workers. You know, in the industries where our membership has the right to strike, which are group homes and nursing homes, you know, we wound up with contracts that made significant progress. Now, let me put that in context. You know, by the end of our contracts for nursing home workers in 2025, a nurse's aide will be making just over $40,000 a year. Okay, so, you know, if you got a family of any size, that means that you're still really significantly struggling. But that'll be up from $30,000 a year, and that's quite meaningful. In the places where we don't have the right to strike, and that's home care workers who are even poorer, if you can believe it or not, you know, we still do not have a contract, and that's also true of our state membership. So those are the biggest challenges that we have been dealing with most recently in terms of our collective bargaining fights, and you know, really, the U.S. labor movement has been shrinking for 50 years, right? There's been a 50-year scorched earth campaign to, you know, really break the back of organized labor. It's a little bit different in the healthcare industry, where, you know, that industry grows as opposed to manufacturing, which is, as we know, rapidly shrinking. But you know, it's difficult for workers without a tremendous amount of power, you know, to make the kind of gains that people need to improve their lives. And when folks are part of a fighting organization, they can make some real progress. And, you know, we're proud in the places where we've been able to do that.
Thank you. And Callie, what surprised you the most in this process as you were working with the labor union on common issues?
I think probably the biggest, I wouldn't say surprise, but just growth. It was our organization's embrace of the labor movement, of unions, of, you know, being a part of the history of labor. You know, we were, like I said in our origin story, we're a resident-led organization, and had actually not engaged in anything related to collective bargaining, the labor movement, up until this year. And in doing that, you know, really what we were exposed to the structural oppression baked in, you know, to the clearly the lack of services that Bridgeport was and is receiving from the state, and how that is directly connected to the lack of investment in good quality, high quality public sector and private sector jobs, and how that is directly connected to this cycle of systemic racism and generational oppression. So we come out the other side of this year in a much deeper commitment and solidarity.
Okay, great. I have a question from Debbie King asking whether 1199 has thought about bargaining for healthcare access issues, such as expanding the availability of home care services.
Yes, we have, Debbie. I think the primary way that we've done it is through trying to help support the Build Back Better plan, which, you know, as you know, calls for a really significant investment of about $150 billion in expanding home care services, and also making sure that the home care workforce is better paid. You know, the home care workers are folks who receive federal Medicaid funds to take care of folks that have disabilities, but have no health insurance and no retirement whatsoever and make $16 an hour. So really very much living on the edge.
That's the reason. Yeah, can I just say the reason that I'm asking that question? First of all, I want to say that I think that the alliance that you've done here is very, very visionary and very cutting edge. And from my understanding, really moves the whole question of bargaining for the common good to a broader agenda, because, you know, I think when I've looked at it, it's more like the teachers union arguing for what parents and children need, not just what teachers need. But it did come into my mind relating to Build Back Better about whether or not you see ways in the future of looking at the lack of healthcare services as something that 1199 would bargain for. I'm working with the National Domestic Workers Alliance and our partner organizations in New York State on the whole question of lack of home care services, particularly in rural areas and in small towns where home care workers have to use their car to drive from elderly person or disabled person's house to the next. And the system is totally broken. And I would just love to see 1199 using 1199's power to address some of those consumer issues, which obviously also affect 1199 members when they're older too, and they need care.
Yeah, and look, I would very much like to get to the point where, you know, we have that type of influence in state politics. I could see how we could get there. I do not think we had that kind of political capital in years back. And look, we continue to have an extremely tense relationship with the governor. You know, very, very difficult relationship. So I think on that kind of stuff, when you lack an effective partner in government, it just becomes really, really a lot more challenging.
Yeah.
Would love to get there.
Okay, we have a question from San Antonio that's a challenging one. Apparently in San Antonio, there was a collaboration between labor and community groups looking to address police violence issues and police reforms. But the community groups insisted on linking it to taking away the police union's right to collective bargaining, and that was a problem for the labor groups. What's your relationship with police unions in this work in Connecticut, and has collective bargaining for police been an issue?
Funny you should ask. Callie, go ahead.
Well, two things, but I'll start with the work that we're engaged in Bridgeport. So we actually, as early as 2019, started identifying the police union as a place to address the police violence and lack of accountability. And we actually developed a campaign which has 6 demands, and it's called the Accountable Bridgeport Contract, or the ABC campaign. And it's about using the process of collective bargaining and using the opportunity of a negotiation over a police contract to introduce accountability measures into the contract itself. Now, that is what we want, but the question is, which came up in the summer of 2020, right? When we were all out in the streets, and we heard from members of our police department, or around the country, this concept of bad apples. The question is, the good apples, who are the good apples in the police union, and can they come through on common good, right? Because accountability is a common good proposal. So that's where we stand as Bridgeport Generation Now. And we, through our work with 1199 and Recovery for All have built an initial relationship with the Bridgeport Police Union, because we had to create this long-term vision document. And when it came time as a coalition to say what we wanted to say about criminal justice reform, it took us, what, Rob, like 2-hour-long sessions to get there, I think, because we're dealing with lots of emotions and deep-seated historical racism that takes a lot of time and education and commitment to push through. So it's very early where we're at, but it is, I am hopeful that there's a way forward.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say that as a Black labor leader in a union that is, you know, majority Black and brown, I just want to be very honest about my own personal feelings that the labor movement has largely been utterly cowardly and until very recently on race and particularly police violence, and that most police unions, too many police unions, are just on the wrong side of history. Okay, and you know, we can go back to slave patrols, we can take it to Bull Connor, we can talk about the really kind of openly fascist guy who I think is the president of the police union in either Chicago or Minneapolis. I think it's Minneapolis. You know, and it is not acceptable to me that those of us in organized labor are silent on that fact. Now, you know, do police have a difficult and dangerous job? And, you know, should they make, you know, really good pay and have great benefits? I think they absolutely should. Should they be able to get away with, you know, the type of you know, incredible violence that we all know takes place with the union defending it? Well, you know, our members who are nurses' aides get fired over far less than, you know, putting people in the ground. Okay, and you can be banned from working as a nurse's aide forever based on the allegation that somebody has pulled hair. So I think the part of our role in organized labor is to force those discussions with folks who are not on the right, you know, not in the right place on police unions, and have those discussions where we insist that there be, you know, just some recognition that we got a long way to go before Black lives matter. And that was exactly the discussion that we had here. It was difficult. Callie said it was about 12 hours. I want full credit for all the side conversations, Callie. I want credit for those. But you know, again, I think that discussion would have gone really differently had we not had, I'm sure the discussion would have gone really badly had we not had a year where we had really worked in close partnership on a bunch of different things that were quite meaningful. And so we're coming through that experience, I would say, with, you know, deeper unity, deeper trust, and a deeper level of political alignment, because we did not compromise our principles to keep the coalition together.
Thank you, Rob. Appreciate those comments. I'm sorry if I didn't get to your questions. There were a lot of them in the chat, but our hour is up and I want to be respectful of everyone's time. I'd like to give Joe a chance to say a few words.
Well, thank you, Clayton. And I hope you all have learned a lot from hearing about this great work in Connecticut. One thing that I think that folks on this audience, being the largely Catholic audience, would want to know and be quite interested to know is that the Catholic Campaign for Human Development, through a grant to the Manavits initiative at Georgetown, has helped to create the trainings and the networking and things that are promoting this new approach around the country. And so we're very grateful to CCHD for funding our work here at Georgetown. And as they do the work of the Catholic Labor Network. And as you can hear in the story today, that you know, what's happening in places like Connecticut is being carried on by folks who, you know, are running a parallel track with much of what we've been trying to do within the Catholic tradition as well. And so there's a lot of room for learning and synergy between these endeavors, I would say. Thank you,
All right.
Clayton.
Well, thank you very much. And yes, of course, we want to thank the Catholic Campaign for Human Development for its support of both Catholic Labor Network and the Bargaining for the Common Good initiative. Thank you all for joining us here today. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Thank you.